Welcome back into the Lions247 Podcast. Happy to be with you. I am Tyler Donahue. You're going to hear from my colleagues Daniel Gallen and Tyler Calvaruso in just a moment. As promised, we are going to give you a bunch of new information based on our trip over to Penn State football facilities on Saturday. We spent several hours there in the heart of campus. We heard from James Franklin. We heard from all three coordinators. We got a chance to go face-to-face with a bunch of different Penn State position coaches. And, of course, this roster was largely available to us for an interview format for about an hour period over in Haluba Hall, Penn State's indoor practice facility. So we tried to make up a lot of ground between our staff, get to as many people as possible, bring a lot of that content to you over at Lions247.com. In recent days, we'll continue to do that. We're actually not far out from our next trip to the practice field. We'll be out there on Thursday for our latest look at the Nittany Lions. It should also present a chance to hear from James Franklin again and some players and coaches about progress for the Nittany Lions as they work toward an August 30th kickoff against Nevada. Number 3, as it turns out, in the initial coaches poll, which went live on Monday. Still waiting to see what that AP top 25 looks like. But yet again, another sense of where Penn State stands in the national conversation this year. We have a lot of conversation to get to here on the Lions247 Podcast with Daniel Gallen and Tyler Calvaruso. We called in Calvaruso. Typically, he's on campus for recruiting events, but we brought him on board for Media Day on Saturday because there was, as I said, a ton of ground to cover, a lot of conversations to be had. So, Tyler, we appreciated you for joining us. Of course, Daniel was there, Mark and Grace Brennan. We have video highlights. We have photo galleries. We have a lot of stories up from Media Day as well. And we'll get into what we witnessed on the practice field a few hours after that here across the show. First things first, guys, welcome back on board. And we're officially into football season. I know the games don't start for a few more weeks, but Daniel, when you're sharing the football field with 100-plus Nittany Lions players and you get a look at this coaching staff and you really start to pick up the energy, no matter where you go on campus, it feels unavoidable right now. Happy Valley is starting to swarm around this 2025 squad because they want to see what they can accomplish.
Yeah, with where we are on Tuesday, it's 25 days till that season opener. That's a nice round number to really, hang on to and, and see on the paper, and just makes it feel that much closer. And yeah, I think that Saturday, after talking about a lot of these things over the off season and, getting a couple, getting some feedback here and there from James Franklin, other random availabilities throughout the summer, to really have everyone in one place to go over everything that we're curious about, everything we want to know. It really felt like it jump-started everything getting ready for August 30th and the, 14, 15, 16, 17 weeks after that.
Yeah, it's a long road ahead, and then this is kind of the origin story that we get every year, the start of August. It's nice to see a team in action in spring, but so much of that is about installation. We also know that, a big chunk of the freshman class hasn't arrived yet. You didn't get potential starters until the summer from the transfer portal. And so we got the complete picture in front of us, and now we'll see if this team can stay healthy and if they can go and be successful when opponents come to town, when they got to hit the road. But, Tyler, I want to begin with the guy you spoke with because he was kind of the talk of the town on Saturday, Omari Campbell. We were on this podcast late last week. It was Daniel, Mark, and I. We spent time working our way through all the different depth chart storylines on defense. And a point that we bounced around in Campbell was he's a guy who had an outstanding sophomore season last year, but he did that as kind of the centerpiece of a very underwhelming North Carolina defense. And so what would it look like when you took him out of Chapel Hill, placed him here in State College with what looks like a top 10 ready defense and this new defensive leader in Jim Knowles that everyone's excited about? And boy, oh boy, the early feedback. Knowles names Omari Campbell his defender of the day after the very first practice session with this kid. Remember, he didn't get to campus until the summer. He wasn't around for spring ball. And then we move a little bit forward. I asked Jim Knowles directly on Saturday about Omari Campbell, and he talked about these innate natural linebacker traits that he has seen on the football field that you just don't often find at the position anymore. He says you've got a lot of guys moving from other spots at the high school level. He said this is a true natural fit at linebacker. And James Franklin also raved about the way he came in and tested physically and the way that he has really shown up and ingrained himself within a new defensive structure. He called him a pleasant surprise. I thought that was a big description, Tyler, considering this guy accomplished quite a bit last year. And yet James Franklin saying he's probably ahead of the curve here in the first week of August than what they anticipated themselves.
I'm not even sure Omari Campbell thought he was going to be this ahead of the curve, because in talking to him, there was a point when he first got to Penn State and he's diving into Jim Knowles' defense, diving into the playbook. He's like, wow, this is different. And, that's something we often talk about with Jim Knowles' defense, being one of the more complex systems to install. But he's gotten better at it over the years. And quite frankly, Omari Campbell has gotten better at learning new defenses as well. He told me he had multiple defensive coordinators at North Carolina. So picking up new systems, new schemes, new concepts, that's not something that's foreign to him. So after getting past that initial hurdle at Penn State, he's really hit the ground running. And you're seeing it now in the practice field. He's taking a lot of his reps at the mic. He's settling in really, really well. Just trying to replicate really what he was as a player at North Carolina. Not just a guy who could get downhill, make plays in opposing backfields against the run, get after opposing quarterbacks occasionally as well, just from a leadership standpoint as well. He's well aware of how important it is to be in the center of Penn State's defense. He understands the responsibility of it in Jim Knowles' system. And he's about as comfortable as I think a spring portal addition could be this early in fall camp. He's really just picked things up nicely, and it's not just a sentiments anymore. Now you're seeing it in production. Omari Campbell is going out on the practice field and getting it done.
Yeah, Daniel, one thing we talked about so much is James Franklin and the staff, their desire to go add players who have already proven that they're productive at the college level. They knew that with Omari Campbell. He's done it at the power conference level in the ACC last season. But James Franklin said himself, you just don't quite know what it's going to look like within your scheme on your practice field until you've actually got it in front of your face. And he talked about Omari Campbell elevating the competition immediately at linebacker. But I think a little bit more intel that we came away with this past weekend was that Omari Campbell is indeed getting run at the Mike linebacker position. And when you hear Jim Knowles talk about these natural instincts, and you hear James Franklin talk about this fit, and I also picked Tony Rojas's brain about this a little bit, they're seeing some of the leadership traits already pop up on the practice field in the meeting room. Remember, this guy was on his way towards being a North Carolina leader here as a junior. He was one last year as a sophomore. And Daniel, I think that we're starting to wrap our heads around this a little bit more. We can probably say maybe Omari Campbell's out there a bunch. He will be out there a bunch based on the trajectory that he has laid out early this season. And now I think the question we have is, can he show enough to Dan Connor, Jim Knowles, and James Franklin in the next few weeks to be the guy who runs out of the tunnel on August 30th with the green dot on his helmet, and all of a sudden he is your line of communication, with 10 new teammates around him on the field. He is your connection to this coaching staff because he's got that dot. He's the guy who's disseminating the information like he did at North Carolina. If he can get up to speed and do that, that says a whole lot about what he was able to accomplish without a head start here in Happy Valley.
Yeah, I mean, if you listen to the way that Jim Knowles talked about him, you feel like he is on that trajectory to do just that. Obviously, Knowles is someone that we are getting to know a little bit, learning about him in media situations. I know that there's always like the text when coaches talk, but we infer a lot of things through subtext where, like, for example, James Franklin has sort of his own language when it comes to certain things. And so, we're kind of going through that with Jim Knowles right now. And so to see that kind of effusive praise from someone who is a little bit more understated at the podium and very thoughtful with his words, I think that really jumps out to you. I really like the point that he made about Campbell being a natural linebacker, which is what I think you want at the mic. Because, Tyler talks about it all the time in the recruiting process where you have these players and you're like, okay, they're playing safety right now, or they're playing on the edge, but, they're going to play linebacker, at the next level. Or even Tony Rojas coming in, he was an athlete pretty much at Fairfax with what he did at the running back position. And so I think to hear that kind of feedback about Campbell and, his approach and his understanding of things as a linebacker, I think that really stands out to me because Kobe King did such a good job at that over the course of last year. And we know there were some communication hiccups early on with Tom Allen, everything like that. But so I think, we talked to Jim Knowles after 2 practices, and if Campbell is making that kind of impression in his first 2 practices, I think that bodes well for this Penn State defense.
We're through 3 announced defenders of the day from Jim Knowles. This is something he did back in Columbus with the Ohio State defense, something that we appreciate, a little insight, a little bit of, kind of breadcrumbs that he's leaving along the way from these practices. But the 3 guys who have taken that honor so far, it started out, as we said, with Campbell. Then it was Kenny Wosley, who's a redshirt freshman competing in that nickel cornerback job. And then the other is Dejon Lane, the sophomore safety. So 3 guys who haven't yet started for the Nittany Lions defense. One of them, Campbell, hasn't played a game yet, but catching the attention of this new defensive coordinator thus far. Daniel, you brought up Tony Rojas. I want to pick your brain a little bit later here in the episode about what you witnessed from that linebacker group on the practice field. You were focused on defense. I was focused on offense. We're going to get a little bit of a freshman intel from Tyler Calvaruso as well. But with Rojas, a guy that played a ton of football last year, started every game. But, I spoke with him yesterday, and I know others have spoken with him throughout this year. He doesn't want to use it as an excuse, but he feels like he is far better equipped this year without a medical hindrance, without an injury he's babysitting, that he can go out there and play pretty unleashed and talk about the fact that he's already got his feet underneath him as a second-year starting linebacker. He, like many other, thinks that the launch pad is there for him to have a really big junior season. And he was out there full go during our look at practice. Every feedback that we got, asked James Franklin about him, asked Jim Knowles about him, asked Justin Lustig, the special teams coordinator, about him. I think Lustig said he's competing right now with his A game. James Franklin and Jim Knowles, very impressed by what they have seen Rojas show up onto the field with. I know Dan Connor, when we got with him earlier this summer, he gave a really rave review of how Tony Rojas handled his situation, not being able to bank those practice reps, but how he was able to grow mentally, how he was able to establish himself further along as a leader in this linebacker room and this defensive group as a whole. But when you add him back to the equation, we didn't see him in the spring. And then, Daniel, you add Alonzo Ford, who was another guy that we came out of Saturday. You thinking stock is up for him. He looks great. I spoke with him for a bit. He's about 305. He was in the 320-pound range last year. Feels like he is well set up, far removed from that injury that took place last November and cost him the playoff run. And he's a guy that you talk about the feedback we've gotten lately. He sounds like he's projected to be that second defensive tackle. I think Xavier Gilliam's going to push him. There's a bunch of young defensive tackles we talked about. But Alonzo Ford, because of his prowess as a run defender, that's what people push you toward right now, is what he can do in stopping the run. Really seems to be a strong fit next to Zane Durant. You just hope for this young man, his 6th year removed from high school, he's got a chance to stay healthy, put together a complete season for Penn State, because he was well on his way toward that last year as a rotational piece, suffered that injury, and you got to go back to his days at Old Dominion when he was logging starts. And Daniel, when you look at that and saying Alonzo Ford at defensive tackle, Tony Rojas at linebacker, starting to see things fill out. Omari Campbell's all of a sudden part of the conversation. How are you starting to shift your, narrative about this defense versus where it was coming out of spring with these faces back in the mix?
Yeah, I think it's something that we talked a lot about through the spring, and we had to put a little bit of an asterisk whenever we talked about the defense and what we were seeing, because we knew it was not going to be what was going to be on the field in fall camp in the season, with all the linebackers who missed time in the spring and guys like Ford that we didn't see on the field. I think to start with Rojas, I think getting that feedback on him was very, very promising. And he's someone that he's in kind of a weird spot, I think, where I think there are high expectations for him in terms of what he can do entering year 3, taking this leap. But I think at the same time that he's a little bit underrated as a potential breakout star. I know that, Penn State has done a good job with player retention, and you kind of expect guys to stay for 4 years at this point. But I was a little surprised when people were doing the too early NFL draft stuff in April and May that his name never really popped up. I think that he is someone that by the end of this year could be in that conversation where if he wanted to, he could go, or you could see how he might fit at that next level. So I think he's in an interesting spot. I think the thing that Knowles said, where he picked up things quickly, which was impressive to him when you didn't bank all those reps in the spring. I think that's a positive sign for Rojas as we move forward. But he is one of those guys, though, that despite everything that we've all said, I think we all really want to see a complete, healthy season from him on the field to really get the full idea of what he is.
I'm sorry. Go ahead, Daniel.
With Ford, I think that he's really valuable. The defensive tackle depth when you got into the college football playoff without him, it was the thing where in November, going into November, we're like, wow, look at all these DTs they have. There's so much rotating going on, so many different skill sets. And then Hakeem Beamon disappears, and then Alonzo Ford gets hurt. And suddenly you're worrying about taxing these guys. You're looking for someone to potentially step up to be that next guy. So for Ford to be back, to be healthy, I think is really important. You mentioned that he slimmed down. That's something that we've noted. That I think is that Randy Adarica is the heaviest DT on the roster right now at 306. Watching those guys during practice, they don't look slimmed down. They still look big. They still look like they're taking up space. So I think that is something to note. But with Ford coming back, I think that's huge. I think that he and Durant can play off of each other really well. I think Knowles mentioned, went out of his way to bring up Ford unprompted when he was up on the podium. Something else just a file away.
Yeah. Across the field, some other good returns to report. We were anticipating them, then we saw them. Andrew Rapplier back in action on the practice field at tight end. And then Anthony Donko, who started 10 games at right tackle on offense last year, also working once again. I spoke with Donko pretty extensively on Saturday, had a story up at Lions247.com. We knew there was a realistic chance that it is not only focused on right tackle for him this preseason camp. That is the case. He told us it's about a 50-50 split for him between right guard and right tackle right now. He's trying to win both of those jobs. Obviously, he can't win both. He's trying to win one of them. Nolan Rucci, the primary competitor, as we know, at right tackle. And then a really interesting mix at right guard where he's got guys like Cooper Cousins, the sophomore, a classmate of his, a redshirt sophomore, and Javen Williams also working at right guard. So ultimately, Tyler, I come down to it. This is exactly what we thought it might look like. Somebody is not going to get to trot out there with the first team offense for the first snap against Nevada, unless Andy Kotelnicki and Phil Trout want to have some fun and throw out 8 offensive linemen, maybe 3 other guys get a start. But realistically, someone's going to be a little disappointed here. And Anthony Donko, I brought up that scenario where he's not involved in the starting lineup, and you could hear the disappointment just talking about that possibility. But he says if that's the case, he's going to put that on himself. It's something that he didn't put himself in a position to be a starter because he understands what's around him. And so when you look at this group that Phil Trout has assembled, you've covered a lot of these guys' recruitments. There's a lot of blue chip pieces that he's trying to work through here. What stands out to you, Tyler, about the decisions that need to be made, and ultimately how the ability to consistently and effectively play 8-9 guys maybe this season, how that could be sellable for Phil Troutwine and this coaching staff on the recruiting trail?
I think the first thing that jumps out to me is really this is what Penn State and Phil Troutwine have been building towards since he took over as Penn State's offensive line coach, having this kind of depth. Because you guys remember better than anyone, there were moments early in his tenure where the bodies just weren't in place. And not just bodies in general, quality depth to go along with that as well. Some of those guys, they just weren't up to snuff. That's what it was. That's not a conversation that's being had in State College anymore. It's not a conversation that's being had inside of Lash. All of these offensive linemen that Penn State has brought in, they have traits that play. And you're seeing it with the depth chart really unfolding before our eyes in the manner that it is. And it is a big selling point on the recruiting trail because offensive line, it's not an easy position to crack at the collegiate level. You got to do a lot of things right on and off the field to break a college offensive line too deep. At Penn State, you're seeing a lot of the young guys. You come in, you do the right things, you're going to have the chance to play as early as you could possibly play. I mean, think about how loaded this offensive line depth chart is right now. We haven't even mentioned Malachi Goodman in the conversation, and he's a 5-star who probably would have had the chance to play a little bit earlier at some other places. And he's just not going to, barring injuries, and that's another aspect of it that's big because you always want to have as many high-quality bodies on the O-line and the D-line as you can because, look, it's a war of attrition. It's a long season. Guys go down. Penn State has stockpiled its quality depth. They're in a position where, look, guys go down. They're going to insert some players who can perform at a high level, and that definitely appeals to prospects. Prospects mention it as well. They see what Penn State has built on the offensive line. They know if they go to Penn State, they're going to get developed well. They're going to, in some cases, developed on a fast track. Again, if you show up on the practice field, do what you got to do, you're going to have a chance, and that's a conversation that is had consistently on the recruiting trail. And it's a big reason why I think Phil Troutwine has really been able to take things up a notch on the trail and recruit at an elite level. The fact of the matter is, you look across college football, there are not many better offensive line coaches right now from an on-field developmental perspective and from a recruiting perspective now as well.
Talking about that interior depth, we know Venga Ioane's spot is safe. He's a preseason All-American type. But other than those names I mentioned, you've got a former top 100 prospect in year 3 in Alex Birchmeier. You've got a former top 24/7 recruit who started in the SEC last year for Texas A&M and TJ Shanahan. And, then you tack on Javen Williams, who's now focused at right guard after being loaded up at right tackle during the spring. And you've got Anthony Donko, who's chomping at the bit to get back in the starting lineup. And Cooper Cousins, who really everybody, including ourselves, has been thinking there's no way he's left out of the starting lineup here. But someone's got to be left out initially, I guess. And we'll see how it works out. We talked about this a lot last week and working our way through the offensive line conversation on the depth chart. What will it look like? Will it be the starter getting 50 snaps at right tackle, or will you see one guy get 35 snaps, the other guy get 25 snaps, and so on and so forth, and see kind of a competition extend into the season? A lot to work with Phil Troutwine. We have a lot of coverage of this offensive line over at Lions247.com throughout preseason camp. You mentioned Malachi Goodman there, Tyler. He's a guy that I think we've all been impressed by just, through the eye test. This is the first chance to see him out there in some shoulder pads, and he does stand out. He looks the part of a 5-star freshman, and as we've alluded to, and you have as well, there's just not a clear path for him. Whereas if he showed up here on campus in 2021, it almost feels like Phil Troutwine would have to play this kid in September because you just need him. Now we're not sure when they will need him, and we're not quite sure when he's going to push the envelope and force them to play him. But I'm curious where you feel about those tight ends. Speaking of freshmen who we don't see an obvious opportunity for in the field, Andrew Rolish out there, Brian Kordovich, Matt Henderson later to campus. He's also out there now. You were out there with us on the practice field, and I know we got a lot more freshman buzz to get to later on this episode. But with Rapplier back, and he's a guy who's, I'd imagine going to look better and feel better practice by practice, week by week, coming off of a really extended absence. But with him, Dinkins, and Luke Reynolds situated as those top 3 tight ends as things stand in early August, what's your forecast for that young tight end group? And out of those 3, who do you think right now, high school ratings aside, is best equipped to maybe get on the field this fall for the Nittany Lions?
That's a really good question because immediately you jump to Andrew Rolish, right? Just given who he is as a prospect and what he has shown throughout his high school career as a pass catcher, and really just the overall athletic upside that he has. And I've talked to people at Penn State who have felt, he arrived in State College in a similar spot as Luke Reynolds, highly touted, expectations high, and he's handled those expectations really, really well, and he's done a lot of good things. So Olish is the one you immediately jump at, but don't sleep on Brian Kordovich, and here's why. You talk to people at Penn State, you talk to people who have seen him rep in practice. I mean, the blocking is advanced for a true freshman tight end. He's a physical kid, strong kid, built really, really well, has added more good weight, and that has just only helped his prowess as a blocker. And we talk about him from a physical standpoint, the blocking, that's all well and good, but he's no slouch as a pass catching tight end either. He might not be Andrew Rolish or Matt Henderson, who's still coming in at his own behind the scenes. He's really improving in all aspects of his game. Remember, he also parallel to Luke Reynolds. This past fall was his first time playing tight end full time. So he's still learning the ins and outs of the position. So Olish is the guy you immediately look at from a rankings perspective. But since we're putting rankings aside, I'm telling you, Brian Kordovich, give him who he is as a blocker, just having that in his back pocket, which is something a lot of true freshman tight end don't have. Wouldn't shock me if he factors in some capacity. But that being said, it would be a very, very limited capacity because we all know what the top 3 on this tight end depth chart looks like.
Well, we're more than 20 minutes in, and I know we've got people listening and watching saying, okay, what the heck? What did you see at wide receiver? What did you learn at wide receiver? So let's jump into it because James Franklin wasn't really shy with us when the wide receiver spot came up. He felt like there is enhanced confidence right now. He said a big part of that is you attribute it towards the depth. They feel like they are truly working with a better level of depth right now. I did catch up with Marcus Higgins a bit on Saturday, and he's obviously not – he wants his guys to go out there and prove it, I think. He doesn't want to talk about it a bunch. But there is a level that this reset that took place over the year is kind of coming to fruition the way they hoped it would, where you've got these veteran pieces who've come in from the transfer portal. They've done it on other campuses. They've been captains on other campuses, and this moment hasn't seemed too big for them. I think you're always wondering, if you're adding a wide receiver, that's great. But if you're adding a wide receiver and he's internally aware that he's viewed as a missing piece for a national championship contender, is this going to be too big of a setting? And I think the feedback on Hudson and Ross going back to January has been, no, these guys are up for the moment. And really, Trevor Pena continues to check that off the list. And in fact, we've heard he's flashing as a leader already here in Happy Valley. And so you combine that with this young swell of talent. It's been a while since we've felt like there was really a group of young pieces in the receiver room that you could see on the field this fall and actually see them develop on the field game by game. That could actually happen this year. And so, Daniel, what we heard, I know you weren't necessarily laser focused on offense on Saturday like we were, and I want to hear what Tyler thinks about some of those freshman wide receivers. But when you start to piece it together, James Franklin has been very tight-lipped in the past with us about really putting anything too positive about his receiver group. And like he was a few years ago, he wants the offensive line to show it, and then he'll talk about it. So do you make much of James Franklin going out there on the record and saying this is a group where we tangibly see progress through the first few days of preseason camp and where we are, 7-8 months into the year?
I think it's notable. I think also it's the type of player that you're coaching. I know that you talk about that these guys are captains. They've all played a lot of football. They've all, I think, had really run the gamut of experiences. When you think about, Trevor Pena dealt with injuries at Syracuse, working through that adversity. Devontae Ross, being a small school guy who had, an interesting recruiting process and then finds his footing. Kyron Hudson, working his way up through a talented room at USC. All these guys, it's one of those groups where you kind of make a thing where it's like, what could they see that they haven't seen before at this point? And so I think when you're dealing with a group like that is experienced, that top three, you can go out and you can, I don't necessarily know if challenge them is the right way to put it, but you can put those expectations on them because they have, dealt with them before. They've produced, they've been through things in their careers. So I think that's one of the framings that I think I'm looking at it through. But I do think that this is a group that we should have high expectations for when you talk about what they've accomplished, what they have at quarterback, and then you hope that the leadership that we've heard so much about can help bring some of these younger guys along, whether that's a redshirt freshman like Tyseer Denmark or one of the true freshmen like a Kobe Howard, Derek Samuel, etc. But yeah, I mean, I think that my ears kind of perked up when we were getting concrete things about this wide receiver group, as opposed to we'll talk about it in August, we'll talk about it the last Saturday in August, we'll talk about it in September. But yeah, I mean, I think that for where we are at this point in the season, at this point, in camp, that was positive to me.
We had Andy Kotelnicki figuring out the offensive line plan a great challenge, a great positive challenge. And I think this is for Marcus Hagans. I don't know if it's so much a challenge. I think he sees what these freshmen look like, but we've talked about it in the past, Daniel. And Tyler, I want to bring you in here. The challenge, I think, for this wide receiver group is 6 solid. Can you get to 6 solid guys? Because last year you weren't all that productive, and yet you couldn't go beyond 4 guys. And so that's kind of a marriage that just really hurts your team. It hurts to watch as a fan. And so I think the key is here, can you have a productive group of guys at the top? That's great. But is there a group underneath them who can step in, whether there's an injury or a guy ahead of them isn't getting it done, and you're not going to have a significant drop-off? You're not going to be wondering if he's going to accomplish his task on a play-by-play basis. Liam Clifford is a guy I don't think you're going to have any worries about. But at the same time, is Liam Clifford a guy that this staff feels like they have his ceiling figured out and they maybe want to get looks at some other guys? I'm not sure. I'm not putting Liam Clifford to the side in any way, shape, or form. But for the sake of this particular conversation, Tyler, a lot of our attention is on the younger pieces. And I want to pick your brain on those true freshmen. You got to look at them on the practice field on Saturday. I've been hearing really good things about Tyseer Denmark again. That kind of picks it up off the spring. I think he's going to be an impact player some way, shape, or form as a redshirt freshman. Josiah Brown, Peter Gonzalez, also second-year receivers. Gonzalez coming off that injury. But this true freshman group, so fresh to campus, a couple of them, these are their first few practices. So what are your biggest takeaways thus far based on what you've witnessed, based on what you've heard? And what do you think? What's the number might look like about guys who could really be ready to stake a claim to one of those 6 potential wide receiver spots in the next several months?
Yeah, there were 2 true freshmen I really wanted to see over the weekend. Kobe Howard, Jeff Exner. That's not a slight at Matt Outen or Derek Samuel, because I think everyone who listens to the podcast knows I've been pretty effusive in my praise for those 2. I still think they're going to be a little bit longer term of a play for Penn State. Both are adjusting still to a pretty significant uptick in level of competition, as opposed to the competition they played against in high school. So I think those guys, they're still growing on and off the field. So that's why I had Howard and Exner circled. And I know probably raised some eyebrows when I brought up Exner as one of those true freshmen to keep an eye on when we had this conversation leading up to fall camp, because you think, oh, he's a summer arrival. He's behind the 8 ball as opposed to some of the other guys. But these McDonough kids, they always show up really, really prepared on and off the field, especially from a physical standpoint. I wanted to see Jeff Exner and how he looked out there, how he was moving. And he has a case to be the most physically advanced true freshman wide receiver on this roster. I think Matt Allen gives him a real run for his money in that department, given his blend of size and athleticism. But Exner continues to look the part. I think he was moving really, really well. I continue to view him as a high floor kind of guy in this Penn State offense. Now, does that translate to a quote unquote, for lack of a better term, big role as a true freshman? We'll see how he progresses throughout fall camp. But when you look at a high floor kind of guy, as opposed to a Lyric Samuel or Matt Allen, who are very, very high ceiling guys, Exner strikes me as a guy who could be more likely to contribute in year one right off the bat, maybe full factor into that top 6 in some capacity, as you mentioned. I think Kobe Howard, I think it's less of a question mark at this point. I think he's got the goods to factor into that top 6 and be a guy in this Penn State wide receiver rotation in year one. And here's why. The big reason why I want to see Kobe Howard, I've seen him twice, Saturday being the second time. The first time was last summer at Whiteout Camp, where he turned in a performance that cemented his spot in Penn State's 25 signing class. But there were still questions, from a speed profile, just overall, athletically, how would Kobe Howard develop? How would he develop in that area? And he's checked a lot of boxes. I talked about it last time I talked about Kobe Howard. He's gotten significantly faster. And seeing him run routes on Saturday, I mean, he is so much more fluid now than I think he was at this time last summer. And that's saying a lot, because he wasn't, he wasn't behind in his development in that area. But I think his improvement has been tangible. And you guys saw it during spring ball, him making plays with the ball in his hands. I got the chance to see it on Saturday. Just watching him move around, watching him catch passes from Drew Aller, watching him break off his routes in a significantly improved manner. It's an area where he has clearly developed. I think his arrow is very clearly pointing up. And I think as the year goes on, Kobe Howard's the kind of player who only gets better. Where does that leave him in Penn State's wide receiver rotation? I think it leaves him with a place.
Yeah, the folks have been down in Florida. They've been telling you that he's going to be like this dude when he gets to a campus since he was a freshman in high school.
Yeah.
Along the way, pretty significant injury. A lot of schools take a step back, reevaluate how they feel about him as a recruit. He takes some time to recover. But here he is at the end of that path. This is basically what people thought he would show up to a college campus and create buzz, and he's doing that. It was a different route over the course of his high school career because of what happened, but the end result is there. And I think what we continue to hear is veteran presence for a freshman and becoming too much of a threat, a guy who can just do too much with the ball in his hands to leave on the sideline over the course of this season. Once again, you're curious, is this somebody who has an audition ahead of him against Nevada, against Florida International, against Villanova? There's a lot of guys that I think we'd like to see get that extended audition in those 3 matchups to see if they're ready for prime time, ready to be a contributor in Big Ten action. I do want to flip it over to Jeff Exner really quick, because for me, walking away from that field, Tyler, he was the guy that I came away with and saying, okay, I got to recalibrate what I think about Jeff Exner Jr., because he is somebody that you told me was doing good things, and you put him in your top 5 as a potential impact freshman. That did surprise me a bit. I had Kobe Howard in my top 5, but not another receiver. I didn't really consider another receiver, but now I think I have to, because Jeff Exner, I had to double check the numbers. I was like, are we sure this isn't a transfer? Because he looked filled out. You told me he was 21 years old. Yeah. I would have believed you. And he's also someone who, when I saw his measurements, was he 6 foot? Was he 6'1", 220 plus pounds? Yeah. Right. So I saw that on his initial listing, and I'm thinking, how does this translate when he's running routes? Is the coordination there? Is this a kid who's kind of a tweener? He's not a tight end. He's not a wide receiver. No, he looked fine at wide receiver. I thought the footwork looked good. I thought the coordination looked tight as a route runner. And I'm not surprised that he showed up to campus from the McDonough School down in Maryland, ready to push. I mean, we saw PJ Mustipher burn red shirt. We saw Denai Dennis Sutton burn red shirt. We saw Curtis Jacobs burn red shirt. Devontae Thomas got here, didn't burn red shirt, but made a good impression early in his career. And so these guys, they tend to show up ready to push. And so something to monitor there at wide receiver beyond Kobe Howard in this freshman class. A lot of good stuff about Lyric Samuel this spring. But to me, Jeff Exeter, just because where he is physically, that's something to monitor. That's something to watch. And I want to see what he can kind of push in a room where there's veterans who obviously don't want to leave the field as well. In terms of quarterback, Drew Aller working with far more autonomy this year. According to Anna Kotelnicki, he's earned that ability to kind of be someone who doesn't need a coach breathing over his shoulder, constantly coaching him on every single little thing. But when it comes to what's going on behind quarterback, at quarterback behind Drew Aller, now that's going to be a storyline to follow. And Daniel, you were kind of in the center of that on Saturday. You had a story up for us at Lions247.com because James Franklin told us during his press conference he could see this quarterback 2 battle not just going into the season, but going throughout the season. Where it's a week-by-week conversation of who's the best quarterback behind Drew Aller against this particular opponent. And I think there's a lot of merit to that approach, especially as we talked about last week, where the transfer portal is hard to ignore for quarterbacks, especially if they feel a little bit buried in their situation. And so you spoke to those 2 QBs. You got a little more insight. What do we need to know about that battle? And it could be a 4 or 5 month engagement.
Yeah, I think to start, when you're talking about 2026, that did come up with both Jackson Smolik and Ethan Grunkemeyer, and they both dismissed that, because your logic, if you finish this year as the number 2 quarterback, potentially you go into next year post Drew Aller with a leg up. But they were both kind of like, dude, we got to get through today first. Like, we have practice tonight. You can't be thinking about that right now, 3 days into camp. But overall, it seemed like that it's a very it's a competition, but it seems like it's a very jocular competition. That I think these are 2 guys that have a lot of respect for each other, that have a level of friendship, and that they know that what the stakes are, and they know that it could be a week-to-week thing. I think that they both have different sorts of experience at this point in college. Like it looks different, and it's not really on the field, but they've worked through different things. I know I texted you, Tyler, when I was writing up that piece, that combined you've got 2 game appearances and 13 snaps between these 2 guys going into the 2025 season. Now, Grunkemeyer was able to bank a ton of number 2 quarterback reps after Bo Verbeul left and Penn State goes on the extended college football playoff run. That's pretty valuable for him. Jackson Smolik, meanwhile, is a year older. So he has another year in college and spent last year watching and really working on the mental side of the game. And he said that that's what allowed him to come back without any rust. I mean, James Franklin has mentioned it. Danny O'Brien mentioned it. They were both surprised that when they got to the spring and Smolik didn't really look like he'd missed a season with a significant injury, that he was back and he was ready to go. I think that that's something that's really notable, just because when you talk about pedigree, Smolik being out of sight, out of mind, recruiting rankings, it is really easy to pencil in Ethan Grunkemeyer in as that number 2. Just if you look at everything on paper, talking about Brad Mendler, similar quarterback trainer as the starter, you can really connect those dots. But Smolik he's not going to go away quietly, I think. And I do think it'll be week to week. The one thing I did ask Smolik about coming back from that injury is that his junior year, he missed significant time out in Iowa because of an injury. And so I asked him if that experience, he was able to apply it so that when he had this time, that he knew how to handle it and was, equipped with the mental side. And he did say that played a factor in it, that, with his approach, he knew what he needed to work on from the mental standpoint. I think it was one of his goals that when he did finally get back on the field, to be caught up mentally, and then the rest of the physical stuff in terms of being back from an injury would come. So I think these 2 guys are both in a good position to be that number 2 quarterback. I think where we stand right now, August 5th, I wouldn't really be surprised if it's one or the other when we get to August 30th. But I think that it'll be something that, maybe every Wednesday night in the fall, James Franklin gets that who's going to be the number 2 quarterback on Saturday question.
I had been thinking about this too, because it makes a lot of sense to at least wait until after, if you're not fully thinking like it's clearly this guy, it's clearly he's won the job, he's our guy. If you're not at that point on August 28th or whatever, makes a lot of sense to maybe come together and plan and say we're going to get a look at Grunkemeyer when we're up by 35 points against Nevada, we'll get him some possessions. And then when we're up by 35 points in the second half against FIU, and I know this is the kind of conversation that James Franklin will never have publicly, but when we're up by 35 points against FIU, let's see what Jackson Smollett can do in that situation. I think there's you mentioned it, there's just such a small sample size of these guys going up against live defenses. I know we talk about, we don't see much 11 on 11, but even in 11 on 11, you're not getting your ass handed to you by a defensive end. That doesn't happen on the practice field. So you want to see them face some of these circumstances and understand how they bounce back from them in live action with their teammates around them, looking to them as being that orchestrator of the offense. So we'll keep tabs there. Competition is always the name of the game at cornerback, year in, year out. That's why we've seen the cream rise to the crop and a bunch of guys go off to the NFL. A bunch of guys earn all Big Ten status over the year. And I know he has All-American ambitions for A.J. Harris. Terry Smith has told us about Elliott Washington and Audavian Collins battling for that job opposite of Harris. And additionally, we expect to see a third cornerback on the field with a bunch of regularity because of that nickel position. Tyler, you spent some time speaking with Terry Smith. I took my cap off to him last episode of this podcast because it feels like every year he's got this blend of established star talent, and then he's got this group of young, promising potential. And it feels like those two things are going to meet in the middle this year, and it gives you really a complete package from a depth chart perspective.
Yeah, if you're wondering how much we have to talk about on this episode, I mean, we're 41 minutes in. We're just going to start talking about Darius Dixon, who was one of the hottest names at really every turn on Saturday, receiving unsolicited praise and received a lot of praise in my conversation with Terry Smith. Darius Dixon is the kind of talent where if Penn State's cornerback chart, and let me preface this by saying we all know Terry Smith is not afraid to burn a red shirt on a player that he really, really likes and thinks can contribute. Darius Dixon could very well be that guy, whether it be high-level special teams contributor or playing some sort of role in the secondary. If Zion Tracy wasn't such a strong candidate to win the nickel job, and I say strong candidate with a little bit of a wink because I would be shocked if he's not the nickel come week one, Darius Dixon might have a case because he's arrived at Penn State battle-tested from his prep career at Modern Day. He has not been fazed by a single thing that has been thrown at him in State College. And the same can be said for Jameer Joseph as well, playing in North Jersey. These were two guys Terry Smith had a ton of praise for. Neither of them, and Terry Smith, he laid out an example for me, actually. Some of these guys, they get to college and they go through one-on-ones and they lose some reps. It happens in one-on-ones. But some of these kids, they're not used to losing reps in one-on-ones. They're not used to losing reps on the practice field. And the fact of the matter is, some of them don't handle it well until later on in their college careers. Darius Dixon, Jameer Joseph, they've been through those battles. They've lost some battles in games, in big spots. So arriving at Penn State, they've both been able to hit the ground running, obviously at different times, Dixon being a winter enrollee, Joseph just arriving a little bit more recently as a summer guy, but they've both been able to hit the ground running in their respective careers and maybe even carve out a role early on in their respective careers. So you couple that young talent with the established names on the depth chart. I mentioned Zion Tracy, A.J. Harris, Audavian Collins, all the guys who are the usual suspects for Penn State fans, and you got to love the depth at the position. I mentioned the offensive line depth chart is being loaded. I think the cornerback depth chart is just as loaded because these young guys that Terry Smith has brought in, they're ready to play if needed. A lot of that has to do with their high school backgrounds, but also what they've accomplished since arriving in Happy Valley. Because again, just because you're battle tested doesn't mean you're going to be that guy right away. Darius Dixon and Jameer Joseph have done everything asked of them. They've coupled their high school experience and they've parlayed that into some early success at Penn State. And I think if you're a Nittany Lions fan, you got to be really encouraged, not just with the present state of the cornerback room, but what lies ahead in the future as well.
This time last year, I kind of surprised myself in doing some writing about how I felt the 2024 cornerback room actually had the potential to be better than the 2023 cornerback room, because if you remember, they lost 3 cornerbacks from that group last offseason who had like 1,500 combined snaps during the 2023 season. Kalen King, Johnny Dixon, and then Daquan Hardy. And so ultimately, I think that did probably prove to be the case big boost by the transfer pickups, and one of them's now gone in Jalen Kimber. And despite him being gone, and despite Cam Miller, who's played a bunch of football for you here, now wearing a Rutgers Scarlet Knights uniform to finish out his college career, again, I think this is a group that can take another step forward because of who you talked about. Darius Dixon and Jamir Joseph, and they're waiting in the wings. But Davian Collins is more of a proven commodity than he was last year. Last year, he was kind of a buzzy name. What we saw him do during the final stretch of the season last year, that adds more credence to who he's going to be for you in game action. Elliott Washington just put together one of the most complete off seasons of any cornerback that we've covered here at Penn State. And meanwhile, you've got Terry Smith saying All-American expectations for A.J. Harris. So, Daniel, it's something to be said about Smith in year 12 where you feel like the group is probably about as good as it's going to get, and then you show up for the next year and the team gets back on the field and you think, no, this might be a better cornerback group than what we saw last time around.
Yeah, it's pretty wild when you think about it, especially that 2023 room where obviously Kalen King didn't get drafted where he expected to, but he still got drafted. Daquan Hardy got drafted. I think if Johnny Dixon didn't get hurt in the pre-draft process, he gets drafted. And then you turn around last year and you don't really spend much time thinking about those guys and what you lost with them moving on. I think it's going to be a really fun group to follow this year, both in terms of what we are seeing from them on the field and what they're able to do. I think Elliott Washington popped up on the freaks list yesterday, and he's someone that I think we've really only heard good things from. So what is he going to do? How can he break out this year? And then behind them, it's going to be fun when you see, all right, when is Darius Dixon going to see the field? When is Jamir Joseph going to see the field? Are they going to see the field in meaningful time when the game is in doubt as we work through the schedule? I mean, I think that it's going to be really interesting to see how that playing time is distributed, how you juggle these three starters, how you can mix and match these different body types, these different talents you have, and just what the whole thing looks like. We talked about it when Penn State was using that Prowler package, that it was a way to get all your pass rushers on the field, get all your DBs on the field, because you have all those safeties, all those cornerbacks. What is Jim Knowles going to do to really maximize what he has on the back end?
Yeah, Jim Knowles himself said when he looks at that cornerback room, he sees playmakers. And he talked about having a desire. I think James Franklin actually may have mentioned this phrase, but they're going to have more, quote, coverage diversity because of all the different body types and the talent they have back there. We heard good things about how King Mack reacclimating himself with this program, battling Dejon Lane and some other safeties there to start next to Zeki Wheatley. But as we focus here at cornerback, it's just a good example of where this roster is in 2025. And you can work your way down the depth chart and still feel really good about a lot of these guys. My guess is we'll see Darius Dixon play on the first kickoff or punt coverage opportunity at August 30 against Nevada. He, to me, I put him as my number one impact freshman when we had that conversation here on the podcast a few weeks ago. Hearing Justin Lustig, and I threw it his way. I said, any freshman at all? He only mentioned one name. He only felt comfortable mentioning one name, in Darius Dixon as a guy who he felt like could find that path and is showing up and pushing for that path to play special teams. And then you work off that and see what he can do defensively. We're going to get to some more freshman buzz to finish off this show. But Daniel, I wanted to kind of turn the mic back over to you because Tyler and I were giving some observations of what we saw on the practice field. A lot of those at wide receiver, some at tight end. What did you witness on defense that you think is worth showcasing a bit here in the podcast? Obviously, you've got an in-depth notebook over at Lions247.com. We've got two separate notebooks for offense and defense up on Saturday. We'll take that approach again when we're on the field on Thursday. But I thought you did a very thorough job. We're obviously taking attendance a bit. We're trying to see what guys look like a few years beyond last time we saw them in pads. So anything to pass along here?
Yeah, I think one thing to add to what you're talking about with the contributors on special teams, we know that James Franklin likes to defer when they win the coin toss. So I think we're almost hoping that they win the toss against Nevada so that we can right away, we can see who's on that kick coverage team and figure out where a lot of guys stand. I think looking at this Penn State defense for the first time, I spent a lot of time watching the linebackers and how they move. And I think I was really struck by I think separation in athleticism that you see from that top group, where, the way that Adam DeLuca, Tony Rojas, Keon Wiley, Omari Campbell, the way that they move is a little bit different than the younger guys. And you're seeing, like, I think Anthony Specca is moving more fluidly than we saw him last year. That you can really see the physical development as these guys come along. I think that's something that stood out to me. I already mentioned that the defensive tackle group, that even though those weights are down, there's no one in the 320s right now, that if you looked out there on the field, you wouldn't say, oh, this group is undersized, or, oh, this group is small, or, oh, this group is missing a big space eater. I think that they still have those different body types, those different skill sets. So yeah, I think that as we go week by week, it's going to be interesting to see maybe the order that guys go through change. What do the lines look like? Who's moving up? Who's falling back? In terms of attendance, everyone on the defensive side of the ball was there except for Max Granville, Jordan Mayer, and Dante Nastasi. This time of year, that's great. Now, Penn State they upped the physicality the past couple of years. So in a couple of weeks, are you still going to have that full deck as you go into the season? I think those are a couple of the things that I'm watching when we get out to the practice field.
I'm glad you referenced the bumps and bruises angle, and now the pads are coming on. We got to look at the shoulder pads coming on, the full pads come on, the contact gets amplified. There could be some absences next time we get a look at the practice field. And the tricky part of our jobs and a tricky part of reading our practice reports is what's maybe going to affect this team August 30th against Nevada, and what's just precautionary load management type of absences over the course of this preseason camp, which, by the way, they're getting some good weather for this year. We're getting great weather in Happy Valley. It's barely getting into the 80s on a daily basis. It's getting down to the 50s at night. So in terms of a player putting on pads and working through preseason camp, this is pretty ideal stuff. I did want to mention, though, Caden Saunders ruled out long-term. That was established on Saturday, just ahead of media day. Daniel was able to confirm that with Penn State. And so, unfortunately, more extended absence for the 2022 top 24/7 recruit. He was a key part of that class in 2022. High expectations, I know, internally, and what we talked here, maybe some KJ Hamler comparisons and what he could be on the field. But to this point, year 4, still dealing with injury setbacks, and we wish him well. Hope he gets back and gets another opportunity to be full go on a college field, but kind of removed from the equation once again at receiver right now. Tyler, when we look at the freshman buzz conversation, we've hit on a few of them over the course of this show. Let's finish there, and I'm going to bring up a name that I kept hearing about on Saturday. I didn't necessarily know I would. Chaz Coleman, freshman pickup out of Ohio. You called him Penn State's biggest recruiting win of the 2025 cycle because of the battle they faced with the Buckeyes making a strong push to keep him in his home state late. He stuck with Penn State. He got to campus this summer, and you said, just keep an eye. There's people saying he could be an early NFL type prospect when he puts it together. 6'4", 240 pounds. You can work with that as a true freshman. And it turns out off the field, on the field, he's turning heads right now with his length, with his height, with his bend, and his ability to really pick up, it sounds like, on some nuances of defensive scheme that maybe are a little bit tougher for freshmen to typically digest. I think that's going to be the key for Coleman, not being around since January. So, Tyler, what do you have to offer us on Chaz Coleman, kind of the book on him, what you continue to hear early? Because he's just a few practices in, and all of a sudden people are pairing him up with Ivan Kamaju, who we've talked about for a while, as potential impact edge rushers from this freshman class. And if there was ever a year you needed impact edge rushers from your freshman class, this might be it for the Nittany Lions.
I think he's caught a lot of people by surprise just because you said it, and I said it earlier. This isn't an easy system to pick up on as a true freshman, especially a guy who's really still diving into what it means to be a pure edge rusher. Because remember, Chaz Coleman, there was a time, well, really, majority of his high school career where there were positional questions. What would he be at the next level? Would he be a tight end? Would he be a pass rusher? Just because high-level athlete, you could slot him in a bunch of different places, and he projected as a high-level guy at the next level, and he's putting it together really, really early at Penn State. The traits that Penn State loved throughout the recruiting process, a lot of other Power 4 programs loved, he's taking those traits. He's taking that raw athleticism, that potentially elite quick first step, and it's showing up on the practice field, and he doesn't really miss assignments. He's on the ball with what he needs to be doing. And then off the field, and none of this surprises me because Chaz Coleman has been very, very bought in to Penn State throughout his recruitment. Ohio State came in late, like you said, and we see it all the time where Ohio State comes in late for an in-state guy and they get it done in like a week or two's time. Penn State fought that battle. They didn't just win that battle, too. They got Chaz Coleman back to campus again after Ohio State's overture. And how Chaz Coleman followed things up after signing with Penn State, he only attended every weekend spring practice. And coming from a kid who's from Ohio, making that trip every single weekend, that kind of dedication opened a lot of eyes inside of Lash. And that same dedication is showing up as a player. He's doing all of the little things that he needs to do behind the scenes to play early. And not just play early, but be an impact guy early. Some freshmen, they miss the mark in that category earlier in their career. They're locked in on a few different areas, but they miss a little bit of the broader scope. Chaz Coleman is approaching things very much like a veteran. And you combine that approach with, again, the elite raw physical traits, you're looking at a guy who, if he continues on this trajectory, because, again, the pads just went on, Saturday was the first pad practice. So there's still a long way to go in fall camp. There's a long time for guys to rise and fall on the depth chart. But if Chaz Coleman continues on this trajectory, would it surprise me if he's right there alongside Yvonne Kamaju early in the year making plays as that buzzy true freshman pass rusher on this Penn State roster? It really wouldn't. And I think Penn State fans need to start coming around on that possibility that there might not just be one true freshman pass rusher making plays at the end in year one. It might be two, with Chaz Coleman being that second guy.
We've got a lot more on Chaz Coleman over at Lions247.com for our preseason progress report. It's going to be a series that we roll out throughout preseason camp. It's based on the intel that we have collectively gathered as a staff. We put it together, and you'll have a lot of opportunities to learn more about this Penn State team over at Lions247.com in the weeks ahead. 50% off deals still going. This is a perfect time to learn all about Penn State. Take advantage of our insider coverage, 50% off right now at Lions247.com. Daniel, you and I will get back together on the practice field on Thursday. I'll see you there. Tyler, I'm not sure when we're going to get you to campus next, but I'm glad we got you to campus for Media Day. Obviously, you've got recruiting coverage locked down at Lions247.com, but thanks for hopping in and sharing some thoughts on this freshman class with us.
Yeah, man, it was awesome being back there with you guys. And I'm usually inside of Hoover Hall. We see coaches with the stopwatches and everything, prospects flying around. This was a much more team setting. And you guys, I know I love it. And I know how much you guys love covering this stuff. So it was great to be back around the team and just really see everything unfold.
All right, fellas, be well.
Yep. Thanks, Tyler.
For now, stepping aside, this has been the Lions247 Podcast. I'm Tyler Donahue. And as I said, 50% off going off right now at Lions247.com.